Okay, so welcome. Let's get this started. Hello, everyone. My name is Mona Robinson, and I'm your host for tonight's event. Thank you for joining us this evening and happy Earth Week. Um, I'm the reference and outreach librarian in the information services section of the California State Library. And tonight we have a co-host, Michael McCurdy, who is a senior librarian in our government publications section. Michael will be monitoring our Q&A section throughout the talk for any questions you may have for Dr. Sardiñas, and we will read your questions during our Q&A session at the end of the presentation. The California State Library is so proud to partner with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and Dr. Hilary Sardiñas to present tonight's California's Native Pollinators program. California is fortunate to have environmental scientists like Dr. Sardiñas, who are literally out in the field every day protecting and safeguarding our natural resources. We hope that this evening's program will engage and inspire you to help protect California's native pollinators in whatever way you can. And before we start, I just have a little bit of housekeeping to go over. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A section, and we will answer them at the end of the program during our Q&A session. This presentation will be recorded and made available after the demo. And live transcription is enabled, so if you'd like to see captions, click the CC icon to show the subtitles. If you run into any technical difficulties during the presentation, please put those in the Q&A section and we will try and help you if we can. We've included a few links in our chat window. One for the State Library's homepage, one for our Ask a Librarian reference platform, where you can submit any research requests to us here at the California State Library. And for state employees who may be with us tonight, we have a direct link to easily apply online for a California State Library card. We are also including a link to Dr. Sardiñas' webpage with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife Science Institute, and several links that are related to her presentation tonight. So now that the housekeeping is over, let's get on to the main event and introduce our speaker, Dr. Hilary Sardiñas. Our speaker today is Dr. Sardiñas, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife statewide pollinator coordinator. Dr. Sardiñas supports conservation related to bees, monarch butterflies, and any other animal in California that transfers pollen between plants to help them reproduce. She works with a variety of partners, including nonprofit organizations and state and federal agencies, to come up with new ideas and collaborations for improving pollinator conservation. Dr. Sardiñas has earned her undergraduate degree in environmental studies from the University of California at Santa Cruz, and she went on to study at the graduate level, earning a PhD in environmental policy and management from the University of California at Berkeley. So please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Hilary Sardiñas.
All right, thanks so much for that introduction. Let me share my screen and just check that everything is working. Should be it. Then I need to do the slideshow. That work? All right. Can you see that? I'm gonna assume that you can.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah, you're good to go. Thank you. Thank you, Doctor.
Well, yes. So as Mona said, I work with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I've been in this position for about 2 years, and I have the great opportunity to work to conserve California's pollinators. So work with a bunch of people throughout the state to do this. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what pollination is and why it's important. And then we'll talk about the different types of pollinators and then discuss reasons why they're struggling. And finally, because it's Earth Day, we'll also talk about ways that you can help support pollinators. So insects drive key ecosystem functions, including decomposition, pest control, and pollination. And along with plants, many of which they help pollinate, insects form the basis of the food web and are important food sources for bats, birds, and other wildlife. But if we zoom in on pollination, many species of plants require assistance to move their pollen from one flower to the stigma of another flower. That's the pollen receptive part. And in the act of gathering pollen and nectar, insects move the pollen between flowers on different plants of the same species. And so in that way, they participate in plant reproduction. And insects that engage in this type of behavior are called pollinators. Now, approximately 85% of plants rely on pollinators to some degree, meaning that plant reproduction and diversity is largely sustained through pollination. And pollinators also play a really important role in agricultural production, with over 1/3 of crops dependent on pollinators. Further, pollinators can increase the quantity and quality of produce, even in varieties that can self-fertilize, like strawberries. And in addition, pollinated crops provide a disproportionate amount of the macronutrients that we need to help us stay healthy. You can see they're really important. And it's really hard to imagine what a world without pollinators would look like. Luckily, Whole Foods did a visualization where they showed what a produce section would look like when the foods that need pollinators were removed. And here you can see what a typical produce section that we're used to looks like, right? It's piled high with all kinds of different fruits and vegetables. But if we remove the foods that need pollinators, most of that produce disappears. And you can see that our plates and diets would be a lot less interesting without the variety of products that pollinators help bring to our tables. Now, if you're savvy, you might notice that oranges still remain in this picture. And this is because they were bred to be seedless and not require pollination. In fact, in the Central Valley, there are actually bee exclusion zones that are aimed at preventing accidental pollination. But of course, pollinators were important for citrus evolution, and they're still important for the protection of a number of other citrus products like limes, grapefruits, etc. So, you know, they're here in this picture, but it might not be the totally accurate picture of what a world without pollinators would look like. So now that you get the sense of how important pollinators are, let's talk about the different kinds of animals that pollinate. So beetles are the most ancient pollinators because they're one of the more ancient insect classes. The second photo is of a butterfly and the third is of a moth. And moths in particular tend to have specific relationships with certain night blooming species. And then in the bottom row, the first photograph looks like a bee, but it's actually a fly. It's a mimic that copies bee coloration patterns to try and ward off predators. And then the next picture is of a wasp that has its head buried in a flower drinking its nectar. Now, there's also a few non-insect pollinators, and the most well-known are the hummingbirds and bats. Hummingbirds are great pollinators of tubular plants, and bats typically pollinate plants whose flowers open at night, like this cactus. And then, you know, in South Africa, they even have pollinating lizards. So there's a lot of different creatures can do this. But you might have noticed that I actually skipped one type of pollinator, which is pretty important, the bees. So before I talk about bees, I just wanted you to spend a quick moment visualizing a bee in your mind. What do you see? How big is it? What color is it? Is it striped? What sound does it make? Right, now hold that, and I'm curious as to whether you pictured a honeybee. This happens to be the most recognizable bee on the planet because humans domesticated them and then moved them all over from their place of origin in the Middle East to every continent except Antarctica, where they can't survive. It's important to note that honeybees actually didn't make it to California until the 1860s. So what was pollinating everything if honeybees weren't here? Well, the reality is there's an astonishing diversity of bees, and they range in size from the carpenter bee, which is the big black bee here, and it's the largest bee in North America, to the tiny perdita or fairy bee, which is what's on its eye, and is it's a grain of rice, and is the smallest bee that we know. And this is just a snapshot of the diversity of bee species. They range from the jewel-like to the wasp-like, from nearly hairless to what I like to call fuzzalicious. And that's not a scientific term, but I do think it's highly descriptive when it comes to some of these bee species. Bees come in a remarkable array of shapes and sizes. There are tiny sweat bees to bumblebees and everything in between. I recommend looking at the USGS, the US Geological Survey's bee inventory monitoring Flickr account, and the link is there. There's just some dazzling close-up photos of bees from across the US and even the world. So if you want to get that close eye view and marvel at bees, you can go there. So given what we've just been talking about, I actually wanted to get to the first interactive poll for this evening. So actually, Mona, it doesn't show up. Oh, there we go, up top. All right, I'm going to launch this poll. And what I'd like you guys to do is just take a guess at how many bee species you think there are worldwide. And I'll just give you a few moments to enter your answer. All right, it looks like most of the polling has stopped, so I will, let's see, oh, almost. There's a few more trickling in. All right, I'm gonna end the poll and I think I can share the results with you. So actually, you guys got it right. The answer is approximately 20,000 bees. And let's see, I think I can stop sharing that and keep going. All right, I'm mastering technology here. Great. And there could actually be more species than this in areas that are hard to study, such as forest canopies. But when you consider that there are less than 6,500 mammal species worldwide, it means that there's actually quite a lot of bees out there. But I did skirt the question that I asked you, which is, what is a bee? So I'm just going to apologize for showing this complicated graphic, but I do think it can be helpful to take a look at the insect phylogeny. You know, as an entomologist, I like looking at the chart of how different insects are related to one another. So insects are the largest class in the phylum Arthropoda, which is invertebrate animals without a skeleton, exoskeleton. Oh, sorry, invertebrate animals with an exoskeleton, pardon me. In addition to insects, this includes crabs and spiders. And the Hymenoptera, which are right here, are the largest order in Insecta, and this includes wasps, ants, and bees. So now let's zoom in on just the Hymenoptera and their phylogeny. And if you look at the pictures on the top, you can see that the ancient ancestors are the sawflies, and then it's followed by a variety of wasps. Ants are tucked in there. But one of the branches of wasps actually led to the diversification of bees. So bees evolved from ground nesting wasps that were carnivores. Their food was comprised of other insects or meat. If you've been at a picnic table and seen wasps flying around, people will be like, oh, there's bees coming for my chicken. Those are actually wasps. And they were out when there weren't flowering plants at all, right? It was just carnivorous and other non-insect pollinated species. But during the Cretaceous period, plants suddenly evolved to reproduce using pollen and nectar, and they proliferated really greatly. And these ground nesting wasps adapted. They became herbivores, and they took advantage of this new food source that they were surrounded by, and even evolved special structures to enhance their ability to use it. So bees actually evolved back when dinosaurs were still roaming the earth. So they're pretty ancient creatures, and they're still really important to our ecosystems today, as we discussed. So you may have guessed that I'm focusing on bees because of all the pollinator groups, they're the most adapted to transport pollen, which they feed to their young. They're the best, so because of that, they're the best pollinators, and their bodies contain specialized structures that have evolved to carry pollen. So honeybees, which are pictured to the left, and also bumblebees actually shape their pollen into balls on their hind legs and baskets, which are called corbicula. And if you've ever wondered where the phrase the bee's knees comes from, it actually refers to the pollen loads on bees' legs, where it looks like their knees are this concentrated source of sweetness. Now, other bees have these brushes of hair, which are called scopa. They're these branching hairs that either occur on their hind legs or abdomens. And entomologists colloquially call these hairy-legged bees or hairy belly bees. And the hairs are branched. So they're these feathery hairs, as is shown in this photograph, which is from an electron microscope. And they're more effective at trapping pollen than a smooth hair is. So all bees have these branched hairs. So as I mentioned, bees need pollen because they feed them to their young. And this is a diagram that depicts a typical bee life cycle. And you can see that it isn't in a hive, right? Most bees dig their nests underground and have several branching tunnels that lead to cells. And the bees go into their nests and they scrape pollen from their scopa into the cells. And when they have enough, they moisten it with nectar and they form a ball. Then they lay a single egg onto that, and then they cap the cell and they never see their offspring again. The egg hatches into a larva, and that larva consumes the pollen ball completely. And that pollen ball is also known as bee bread. And once they eat it, they pupate, meaning they metamorphose from a larva, which is kind of that ghostly worm-like thing, into the pupa, which is another kind of ghostly quasi-bee-shaped thing. And they actually then emerge from the pupa and spend their next year underground in a lowered metabolic state that's similar to hibernation until they get the environmental cues that tell them that it's time for them to emerge and start that life cycle over again, collecting pollen and building nests. So bees spend most of their lives underground, right? They only spend a few weeks above ground foraging and creating nests before they die and then leave their young in the soil to emerge again the following year. And the life cycle we just went through is what is typical for a solitary bee, meaning the bee lives alone, collecting pollen and laying eggs in the nests that they create. They don't have a queen or sisters that do work. And 99% of all bees are solitary. And while some might nest in aggregations near one another, they don't actually help each other. There are a few bees that are what is termed semi-social, which means that they do share nests and are usually related, either sisters or mother-daughters, but they don't tend to split up tasks. So they each will do everything themselves. They'll just share like a tunnel. And then eusocial bees are bees that divide labor among themselves. So honeybees, right, have worker bees that forage and nurse bees that take care of their young. And these social bees have a queen that does all of the reproduction. She actually emits a pheromone that suppresses reproduction in the workers. And even if the workers were to reproduce, it would be, they have not mated, and so they wouldn't have other females. And in a social hive, usually all the bees are sisters. And this is a very, very small proportion of bees. So all of those solitary bees, where do they nest? Well, there's a few different places, but like we discussed in that bee life cycle diagram, most of them nest in the ground, while others prefer plant stems or beetle burrows and wood. And then a smaller proportion of bees nest in pre-existing cavities, like holes in trees. If you remember Winnie the Pooh, right, like going to a honeybee nest in a hole in the tree, but that's a very small number of them, so I won't talk about it more. Approximately 30% of bees are tunnel nesting, meaning they find small tunnels like those abandoned beetle burrows or pithy stems of plants and construct the nest partitions out of mud, or in some cases flower petals, as is shown here, and those are quite beautiful, I think. But the vast majority of bees nest in the ground in tunnels that they dig. And to do this, most species need access to dry, relatively well-drained soil. Ground nests can be fairly extensive, like the nest that was excavated and is pictured here. You can see some of those cells with the pollen and the larva on them. But others can actually be dispersed along the soil surface. And most bees will dig their own nests each year, finding new locations. But in some instances, bees will go back to the same nest over time and can create nests that are meters deep, which is really interesting. And bee nests aren't always obvious. Sometimes they just look like a tiny hole in the ground. So here's an example of a nest entrance of the sunflower specialist bee, Diadasia. And they actually build these little turrets out of mud that they pull out. Sometimes it can be a lot taller. And that kind of helps mark their nest entrance. And this is a bee that aggregates when they nest, so they're solitary, but they all nest close together. And then they move their sites every year to avoid parasites. And what's cute in this picture is you can actually see some of the pollen scraped off around one of the nest entrances. So based on what we just discussed, it's time for our second quiz. So this is where you get to think about where you might expect to see the highest diversity of bees. So let me launch that. All right, I'll give you another minute to do that. This is fun seeing how the options change just to answer. All right, it looks like most of you have answered again. So I'm just gonna end the poll and let's see, I think I can share the results. Oh, that's great. So some of you picked tropical climates, some temperate climates, and other Mediterranean, a lot fewer desert climates. So let's take a look at the results. All right, I think I can get back to, all right. So actually Mediterranean climates and some actually moderate desert climates have the greatest diversity of bees. Temperate climates also can support a high diversity, but not as many. And then in tropical areas, it actually gets really wet. And given that a lot of bees nest in the ground, it's not as optimal of a climate for them. So this is a map that depicts the areas with the highest bee diversity, and that's in maroon. And then areas of lower diversity are in yellow. And there might be a slight sampling bias in this because certain areas like Africa we know are just really understudied. But again, you can see this really dark concentration in all of the Mediterranean climates, right? California, South Africa, the actual Mediterranean, right? Chile. So that's where we see the highest diversity, followed kind of by deserts and then temperate areas, with less, although still a fairly high amount in some tropical areas. Pretty good distribution. Now, if we zoom into the US, we can look at places that support more species, particularly at-risk species. So here on this map, the yellow is actually indicating a higher number of imperiled species, and the blue is lower numbers of imperiled species. And unfortunately, California has the highest density of imperiled pollinator species. And part of this is because we're a biodiversity hotspot. So that means that we have varied ecosystems within the state that support a high diversity of species, including a large number of endemic species, which are species that only occur in California and nowhere else. All right, sorry to do another quiz so fast, and you guys got the other number right, but given what you've just seen, I am just curious to see how you do guessing the number of bee species that occur here in California. Thanks, you guys, for participating in all these polls. I think it's a lot more fun to be in talks where you get some participation. Oh, we're inching towards. All right, looks like that stopped. So I'll end the poll and share those results. So nobody thought 100. That makes sense, given that we talked about there's a 20,000 bee species worldwide, and we have a lot. A few people thought 600, and then on the high end, some people thought about 3,600. Actually, 3,600 to 4,000 is about how many bee species we think there are in the US, the entire US. So that means that here in California, we actually have about 1,700 species. All right, go back to my slides. There we go. So where does this number come from? Well, entomologists submit data to a variety of areas, and we also have collections from museums across the country, and a lot of those have been digitized. And the US Fish and Wildlife Service pulled all of those records into this great thing called the North American Bee Tool, and it's actually records from Mexico, the US, and Canada. So it's great. And so these are records from California. And you can actually see that most of the records are concentrated in urban areas, which makes a lot of sense, right? People are looking there more frequently. And what's neat about this tool is we can also see when people observe the highest number of species. So most of these records were from between April and June, which is right now. And it's also the time period that coincides with the highest abundance and diversity of plant species in bloom. It makes sense because pollinators need their plants. But despite the state hosting a large number of species, many of them have been assessed as vulnerable, imperiled, or critically imperiled. In fact, up to 25% of the bee species that have been assessed fall into these categories, though it is important to note that only about a third of our bee species, or a little under 500, have actually been assessed. Now, unfortunately, though, this trend of about 25% being in these vulnerable categories holds when we look at a specific genera and across broader areas like North America. So bumblebees, for example, are the most well-studied and well-known native bees. And the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, conducted a review of imperilment of North America's bumblebees in 2014. And the report concluded that 25% of North America's bumblebees were at risk of extinction. 4 of these species, which are pictured here, have actually been petitioned for listing under the California Endangered Species Act. And one of them, the Franklin's bumblebee, is already federally listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And that species has not been seen in California since 1998, and it hasn't been seen anywhere in its range, which extends up into southern Oregon since 2006. So really quite a threatened species. And again, it's unfortunately, this isn't just applicable to bees. Butterflies are okay. Oh, great. I'll just keep going.
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah. So NatureServe is a nonprofit that assesses, that helps assess how populations are doing. And they've actually found that 17% of North American butterfly species are at risk, including species that we consider common or have maybe up until this point. So there is this great recent review of long-term data collected in the West, and it indicates that butterflies with widespread distributions like the West Coast lady, which is pictured here, are in decline. And the study looked at 3 independent data sets, and in each they found evidence for a linear decline, so that's shown in the graphs, over the past 30 years. And concerningly, the researchers actually detected a 1.6 annual decline across all of the species they assessed. So that means that each year, every single year, the number they detected fell by an additional almost 2%, which is really concerning. And warmer fall temperatures associated with climate change were the strongest variable that they found for helping explain this decline. Monarchs are another species that you've probably heard of because of their recent declines, especially when the population fell to below 2,000 overwintering butterflies on the California coast in 2020. So that is shown in the bar graphs. The population numbers are the vertical lines in this chart. So in 2020, there were virtually none seen in California's overwintering groves. Fortunately, this year they've rebounded to almost 330,000 butterflies. And then, sorry, the line at the top indicates the number of surveys that were conducted. So people were out there looking when their population tanked, but they just didn't see any. What's hard is that we actually don't know why their population is bouncing around so much. But these kinds of large turns in population are not typical because you can see it. They've been more or less stable over the past 30 years. Although they did have a big decline in the early 90s, late 90s. But some of the hypotheses for what's going on include warmer winter weather, where monarchs might be leaving overwintering sites early, not finding a lot of milkweed on the landscape, and that might be impacting their multi-generational populations. What's concerning about monarchs in particular is that they are a very widespread species. They fan out over the entirety of the West. They use a variety of different habitats. So if monarchs are facing issues that are causing their population to decline, it might be emblematic of issues that more rare species with limited distributions are facing. So they might be like a canary in the coal mine. And again, I know this is a talk focused on pollinators, but it's not just pollinators that are declining. Insects across all classes are declining at pretty staggering rates. So this graphic shows the percent decline in a specific group. And some of them are caddisflies, butterflies, beetles, bees, mayflies, dragonflies, even flies, right? And you might have actually seen evidence of insect decline directly. Like this cartoon depicts, 30 years ago, we were seeing a lot of splatter on our windshields. And these days we have a lot less. And while it's not really fun to clean bug debris off of our cars, it's concerning that we don't have as much of it because it means that these important creatures are less abundant than they used to be, and they're not performing the essential ecosystem services that we talked about in our very first slide. So combined, the decline in insects across continents has been termed the insect apocalypse. And given its potential consequences, it's been pretty widely reported. So hopefully you've heard of it. So what is going on with pollinators and insects in general? Why are they declining right now? Okay, it's time for our very last poll, and you get to identify which factor you think is the major driver of bee and pollinator decline. So, all right, here we go. All right, looks like most of you have answered. So you got it right, all of the above. While, definitely certain of these might have more of an impact than others, they all seem to be having some kind of effect. All right. Thank you all again for participating. So these factors don't occur in isolation. All of them are occurring to varying degrees simultaneously. And that means that it's really hard to tease out a smoking gun. And this is a great graphic that I pulled from a recent issue of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, or PNAS, that's titled "Entomologists Acknowledge That Decline May Be Due to Death by 1,000 Cuts." So basically what it means is that these series of interrelated threats on their own might not be life-threatening, but when they're combined, they can actually cause serious damage to insect population. So now we'll just walk through a few of these in detail. So conversion of habitat from natural areas to urban, suburban, or agricultural uses removes flowers and nesting sites from the landscape. And even when habitat is not lost outright, habitat can become degraded when, say, invasive species outcompete native species. And this can have a variety of impacts, right? It can reduce the population of a preferred forage species or eliminate nest sites if access to bare ground is limited by plants like non-native grasses. And then fragmentation often means that habitat is broken into smaller areas, and those areas can typically support fewer numbers of species. Another factor that's been implicated in bumblebee decline specifically is disease. Bumblebees can buzz pollinate, and so that means they're important for the production of crops that need buzz pollination, like peppers and tomatoes. And they're often purchased commercially to pollinate these crops and then placed into greenhouses. But there's evidence that they can escape and spread disease to wild bumblebees that visit the same flowers. And in the mid-1990s, there was an outbreak of the fungal pathogen Veromorpha bombi. It used to be called Nosema, but the taxonomy changed in commercial bumblebees. And this outbreak coincided with the rapid decline of the Western bumblebee, which was formerly one of the most abundant species in the West, as you might be able to guess from its name. There's also concern that honeybees can spread diseases to wild bees, such as deformed wing virus or Israeli acute paralysis virus. Pesticides. So pesticides are chemicals that are formulated to target certain agricultural pests like insects, insecticides, funguses, fungicides, or weeds, herbicides. Overall, pesticide use in the US has increased dramatically in the last 20 to 30 years. And this is not just in agricultural settings, but I do want us to focus on the agricultural settings first because especially in California, we just have a mandatory reporting system for pesticide applications. We have pretty good data, but we also have this great information from USGS, where over a period of time, they were estimating agricultural pesticide applications. So this map is going to show you imidacloprid use from 1994, when it was introduced to the US, to 2010. And what you can see is that it not only expanded rapidly, but the application in areas where it had already been adopted as a pest treatment intensified. And imidacloprid was the first neonic on the market, and it's now one of the most widely used insecticides in the world. Now, neonics are invertebrate neurotoxins, and they are water soluble. So that means that when they're applied to plants, they are systemic. That means that the active chemical can be expressed not only in the leaves, but throughout the plant's vascular system, including in nectar and pollen. Thus, this can expose pollinators repeatedly if they keep coming back to the flowers and blooms that have been treated. So these chemicals can definitely kill bees outright at high doses, but low doses can have sublethal effects such as impaired navigation, impacts to learning and memory, and reduced reproductive rates. And this example is just one insecticide, right? But there are hundreds of insecticides or pesticides on the market in the US, and many of them interact with one another, right? Insecticides can sometimes interact with fungicides or herbicides in ways that make them more toxic than when they're encountered just on their own. But I did focus on neonics in the example because they're a newer class of pesticides that, as I just described, have been associated with increased bee mortality. In this case that I'm picturing is one from Oregon. And what happened was there was a highly attractive linden tree in a parking lot that had an aphid problem and was treated with a neonicotinoid. And they noticed then that a lot of dead bees started accumulating under it in the parking lot. And they realized what had happened, and they went in and they tried to net the tree to prevent bees from going to it. However, the bees were still trying to pollinate through this netting, and some of them were still dying because it was just a really attractive resource. And in the end, researchers collected a lot of these bumblebees and did an analysis and figured out that there were at least 100 colonies impacted. And typically we don't get to see this kind of evidence of a mass pesticide poisoning, so we might not be able to record the impacts to bees in different kinds of landscapes, but they very well could be occurring. If we move on to climate change, it has the potential to impact bees in a variety of different ways. So extreme temperatures could limit foraging and be lethal if it just gets too hot for bees. Increased drought can reduce floral resources, as well as the quantity and quality of pollen and nectar that a plant produces, and that might reduce bee nutrition and health. Plants and the pollinators that visit them often respond to climate change in different ways, and this can lead to a phenomenon known as phenological mismatch, wherein a plant will bloom during a specific period, but a pollinator might have a different period. And so the pollinator comes out and misses the period where it could pollinate that plant. We're actually seeing that a bit this year in California, where we had the really rainy, cold year, and the pollinators are much delayed from the incredible super bloom that we're having, like what's pictured behind me in the Carrizo Plain. Now, some species are definitely better adapted to certain climates, right? We talked about how bees reach their peak richness in Mediterranean or desert climates, but bumblebees are actually more abundant in temperate climates. And this penchant for these cooler climates means that they might already be at the extremes of their range and unable to shift if they need to, if the temperatures get warmer. So here's what I realize is a little bit of a fuzzy graphic, but it just shows that, say a bee occurs, like a bumblebee occurs in a montane environment, they might be pushed up to cooler and cooler elevations, but at a certain part, they might not be able to go any further, and they definitely wouldn't be in the rest of their range. So overall, a more unpredictable and extreme climate is likely to interact with the other stressors we just reviewed as well and have more significant impacts. So again, like that death by 1,000 cuts graphic described, the stressors don't occur in a vacuum. They interact with one another, often to surprising effect. For example, fungicides kill yeast on pollen, and they make that proteinaceous food harder for bees to digest. And that can affect bee nutrition, which has been shown to make them more susceptible to disease. And there's a lot of different other ways that they can interact, but there's just so many unknowns about these synergies that we really need a lot more research to better understand pollinator response. Now that we've talked a lot about the decline and we bummed you out, we actually want to focus on the variety of different actions that you as individuals can take to help reverse pollinator decline. As I said, it's Earth Day. Hopefully you're here because you want to make a difference. So we'll go over the 8 strategies outlined in this paper that you might be interested in getting involved in. And I do just want to point out that as we discuss them, you can remember you don't need to do all of them. Just taking on one that makes the most sense for you would still be making an important contribution. So the first action is to convert lawns into habitat. Unfortunately, traditional lawns are biodiversity deserts and support almost no species. And there's almost over 40 million acres of lawn or turf grass in the US, and these monocultures are just an untapped opportunity to increase biodiversity. Luckily, many insects don't need a lot of space to survive, so even a partial conversion of lawns to minimally disturbed natural vegetation, say 10%, could significantly aid insect conservation while simultaneously lowering the cost of lawn maintenance and reducing the need for watering, herbicide, fertilizer, and pesticide applications. So if every home, school, and local park just converted 10% of their lawn space, and just in the US, to natural habitat, this would increase usable habitat for insects by more than 4 million acres. So it's pretty amazing what a big impact potentially small action would take. And it's something that a professor out of North Carolina named Doug Tallamy is calling homegrown national park. So what Dr. Tallamy is advocating is for folks to convert their lawn and then add, if you've done it, to this map. And he contends that if just 20 million acres of lawn were converted, it would actually be larger than the entire national park system, yet still just represent half of the total lawn acreage in America, as we just talked about. So you could sign up to add your property to be counted. And in California, the state has 100 million acres total, but just 576 acres have been recorded as part of this effort. And while I'm sure that there's a lot more native plant yards out there, it does mean that there's a lot more to be done and that you can participate in. If you're planning to add pollinator plants to your garden or complete even a full redesign, what you want to do is think like a pollinator. So you want to provide a diversity of flowers and also maintain some nesting sites. You also want to avoid ground disturbance or trimming plants with pithy stems, lest you kill all the nesting or overwintering pollinators. In terms of flowers, I generally recommend including a wide diversity of species and trying to include flowers of different colors and types. So open and tubular, open flowers like asters or tubular flowers like penstemon, as these can attract different species of pollinator. It's also important to make sure that your garden provides resources throughout the year, which in some parts of California is actually year-round. And usually I look at CalFlora. We'll look up a species, say like Asclepias fascicularis, narrowleaf milkweed, and I'll get this little chart and it'll show me when the bloom period is, and combined I can kind of look and see if there's overlapping bloom and I have species year-round. If you want more tips, I invite you to check out an article I wrote in fall 2020 for the issue of Flora, which is the California Native Plant Society's magazine, and it's got 10 tips for attracting pollinators to your garden. And it's designed for people who only have small spaces. So I took out some juniper in my front yard and terraced it and had like a 30-foot by 3-foot space and planted it with sometimes non-native plants, but mostly native plants. And we attract a wide variety of pollinators. But even if you just have you live in an apartment and have a balcony and can just put a sunflower, or some other plant on that space. What's neat about pollinators is that they're excellent at finding resources. So even if you just put out, 1 or 2 plants, they will be able to find them. Another recommendation is to go native. So while there are some non-native plants that support pollinators, research actually shows that native pollinators often prefer native plants, particularly if you're looking to support butterflies that rely on specific host plants. It's important to make sure you include those. And native plants not only help native pollinators, but they also support an array of other species. So I just talked about Doug Tallamy of the Homegrown National Park, but he's actually, what he started out doing was research on songbirds. And what he found is that over 90% feed insects to their young. And for many, their diet is actually largely comprised of caterpillars. So because of this, insects form the basis of the food web, right? The caterpillars eat the native plants, the birds eat the caterpillars, hawks eat the birds, right? And all of those things decompose and provide nutrients that help continue that cycle. Now, if you're looking for more resources for how to design your space, I recommend the California Native Plant Society's tool, which is called CalScape. And it's really great and user-friendly. What you do is you answer a series of 4 questions, which include whether or not your garden is in full sun or in shade, what kind of garden you'd like to create. Is it a simple garden? Is it like an abundant one? And whether or not you want to support different species like pollinators, birds, or if you're hoping to conserve water, or even reduce deer nibbling on your plants. And so you answer all those questions. And once you do that, it spits out a great, really comprehensive list of plants that are appropriate for your area. And they even have graphical representations of the kinds of species they support. And what's neat too is that they'll give you a planting schematic that, if it makes sense for your yard, you can follow. And that was another of the tools that Mona put in in the chat. So recommendation number 3 is to reduce pesticide use. As we talked about, pesticides can be harmful to insects, and you can also eliminate it if possible. And again, I know we think of reducing pesticide use as being largely agricultural, but we apply over 59 million pounds of pesticides and fertilizers to lawns annually in the US. And most people that are applying those pesticides in urban and suburban areas are not trained to follow labels, which means that more pounds per acre are applied in cities and towns than in farmed areas. So it is really important to spread the message that we need to reduce pesticide use in the places that we live. So here's an example of somebody spraying in a yard. Another thing that you can do is reduce exterior lighting. Light pollution is actually a really serious problem for a lot of nocturnal pollinators and the animals that feed on them, like bats who evolved for light-limited settings. So there's a great 2017 study that found that light at night decreased visitation by nocturnal pollinators, and that reduced the plant's reproductive output, meaning that it produced fewer seeds. And that could actually impact its population over time and potentially have an impact on daytime pollinator dynamics. Luckily, there are simple ways that you can help restore the dark, and there's these, dark sky movements that are pretty popular. Often it's for just the stars, but it's also really beneficial to wildlife, right? So some things you can do are only using lights when you need them. You could switch a light that is always on to a motion activated light. You could use dimmer lights, so avoid really bright LED multispectrum lights in your landscaping. And you could also switch to amber or red lights whose wavelengths have been scientifically proven to reduce disturbance to nocturnal animals. Now, another thing you can do is to counter negative perceptions and become an educator, because insects get a pretty bad rap. But if you're here today, it's because you understand how important they are to natural processes and ecosystem function. And there are millions of insect species, right? Not just the pests that we're trying to get rid of or that we've been told we should consider scary. And you can help change perceptions by talking to your family and friends about how amazing, important, and imperiled insects are. And you can let them know what they can do to help recover their populations. You can even become an official educator. For example, in the Bay Area, the Pollinator Posse is a great group of volunteers that go to events to teach adults and children about pollinators. Another great nonprofit is the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. And what they do is train ambassadors to conduct workshops and outreach because they get so many requests for speaking gigs. So that's another group that you could volunteer with. Finally, and one that I'm really excited about, is you could become a community scientist and actually contribute data that we use to make management decisions around pollinators. So what is a community scientist? It's a member of the public who goes out and collects data for a particular project using a set protocol. And you might be familiar with the Christmas bird count, but there's a number of projects right here in California that you can get involved in that focus on pollinators. And I just want to emphasize how much these projects really matter, because California is a huge, diverse state, and scientists like me can only cover so much of it. So we need you to be our eyes and ears on the ground, helping us understand important trends. We really do rely on data that you provide to help make management decisions. So the first community science project that I want to highlight is the California Bumblebee Atlas, which is a partnership between the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and the Bureau of Land Management. The goal of the atlas is to survey as much of the state as possible for bumblebees to better understand current trends in diversity and abundance. Volunteers also collect information about the habitats that bumblebees use and which plant species they're associated with. What's neat about the project is you don't need to kill the bumblebees to identify them. You net them off flowers and then put them in a cooler filled with ice. And this chills them out so that you can take macro photographs of them, which you then upload to a website where expert taxonomists provide an ID for them. And after being chilled, you release the bumblebees and they warm up within 5 minutes and they'll fly away. So to get involved in the atlas, first, you can take a live or pre-recorded virtual training to learn more about the project as well as how to conduct surveys. And then you take a quick quiz that demonstrates you understand the protocols that we use to keep the bees safe. Next, you would adopt a grid cell, and those are shown in the map there, in which to conduct your survey. They cover most of the state, but not quite all of it. And then we would ask you to perform at least 2 surveys, if possible, in areas that have lots of blooms that you have permission to survey on in those grid cells. So then again, you would go out to the field, net the bees, chill them, photograph them, release them, and then finally upload your data and photographs to the Bumblebee Watch website. To help you, in case you're worried about handling bees, we also offer in-person trainings for how to net, vial, and photograph the bees. And this year we're holding over 20 different events across the state. So please go to our website and check out if there's an upcoming training in your area. They're totally optional, but really fun. And just to highlight what volunteers can accomplish, last year was our inaugural year of the Atlas Project, and volunteers from around the state conducted 154 surveys and collected 3,666 observations of bumblebees. The surveys are shown in blue on the map of California. And you might note that we did miss some desert areas, but those don't typically support many bumblebees because they need flowering resources over the entire season to support their colony, and deserts tend to have flashes of bloom. So the volunteers also collected important data like the plant species that they caught the bumblebees on. And this figure shows all of the different plant genera that the two-form bumblebee, Bombus bifarius, was found on. And it's really quite impressive. It was a lot. But if we wanted to develop a restoration project that targeted this species, we could use this plant list as a starting place, looking at the fact that it uses goldenrod, coyote mint, lupin, in really high abundance. So it prefers these species. So we might want to include those in a restoration project. And what's great is that we have a list for all of the 22 out of 25 species that occur in California that the volunteers detected last year. Another new project is the Monarch Genomics Project, which is a collaboration between CDFW, the US Fish and Wildlife Service, and 3 research labs. So this project asks community scientists, volunteers to collect already dead monarchs and freeze them to preserve the genetic materials and then ship them to Colorado State University, where Dr. Chris Funk's lab will conduct a genomic analysis. Dr. Funk will then send these specimens to Dr. Louis Yang at UC Davis for an isotopic analysis, which will help us figure out where the monarchs originated in the West. And then finally, they'll get sent to Dr. Micah Friedman at the University of British Columbia, where he'll actually look at which species of milkweed the monarch used, using something called cardinalide fingerprinting. And combined, all of this information can help us better conserve monarch butterflies. And we really need data from the resident population, which is the population of monarchs that breed year-round on the California coast. It's a new phenomenon that we're trying to better understand. But we also need monarchs from interior California during the summer and fall. We actually have a good number from overwintering sites. We want it from the rest of the range. So if you're interested in participating, the website is there, and I believe Mona's put that in the chat. And it can also be found on the Wildlife Branch's permitting website under our Monarch Genomics tab. That's because we do have a scientific collecting permit associated with this project. So to get added to the permit, what you do is you watch 2 5-minute videos, take a quiz. If you pass it, you get added to the permit. And then you can also request some supplies like the glassine envelopes to be shipped from Dr. Funk to you. As well as a shipping label for your return shipping. And then if you find an already dead monarch, you'll put it in the envelope, record the information about where you collected it, and then ship that back to start that whole fun analysis process I described. So please do consider participating in this. It's going to go on for at least another year. So I highlighted 2 projects, but there's a number of community science projects that you can get involved in, some of which are pretty low intensity, like uploading photos of monarch and milkweed that you happen to see on a hike to say the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper or iNaturalist. But you can also do more focused monitoring. For example, the Great Sunflower Project will send you a packet of sunflower seeds, which you can plant and record which bee species use them in your yard. But it's just worth taking a look, seeing what's out there, and deciding if any match your interests and your available time commitment. Finally, this isn't one of the 8 recommendations, but I thought it might be of interest to know that there are a few bee-friendly farming certifications out there. So this allows consumers to purchase products that are produced on farms that create flower-rich habitat and reduce potential pollinator exposure to pesticides. So if you're interested in supporting these kinds of farms, you can look for the Bee Better Certified or Bee-Friendly Farming seals, which are pictured to the side, to help pollinators when you're making your food choices. And I believe with that, I am done. So thank you again for spending some time this Earth Day with me to learn more about California's pollinators and how you can help support them. And I'm happy to open it up for questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Hillary. That was so amazing. Really so much fun. And I think we've coined fuzzalicious now as our new term. So thank you for making it so engaging and delightful. And we have quite a few questions. So if you don't mind, we'll get to as many as we can. And so Michael McCurdy is going to be reading the questions. And so I'm going to toss it over to him. He also posted a couple more links. Thank you so much for providing those links. I don't think I had entered the monarch genomic link in, but I will. But and also your article is in there. So please, everybody read that because it's charming too. So if you're ready, I'm going to toss it over to Michael and see there's some really cool questions. So thanks a lot. Okay, Michael.
All right, here we go. The first question is, Sacramento is known as a camellia city. Are camellias helpful for pollinators?
That's a really great question that I don't know the answer to. I can definitely look it up. Here's the thing. A lot of ornamental plants were bred to be really showy, right? And one of the things that happens, trade-offs when you try and increase like the petals on a plant, it can often be that you're reducing the pollen and nectar that's provided. So actually a lot of ornamental plants look beautiful but don't provide any resources to pollinators, and so that's part of why we recommend selecting native plants, because those often, unless they're like a really highly adapted cultivar, typically provide great pollinator resources. So while I don't know the answer about camellias specifically, that's just something to consider.
All right, that's actually something I've never known, so thank you. Another question that came in, you had a slide earlier in the presentation where there was a ball that bees would lay their the eggs on, and larvae would live off for a while. What was that ball made of?
So that is a ball of pollen that's moistened with nectar. Some bees, specialist bees, will only collect one type of pollen, like the sunflower specialist will only bring sunflower pollen back to their nest, whereas other bees will bring a variety of different pollen species, but then pollen from different plant species, but they'll aggregate it, put it into that ball, which we like to call bee bread. The larvae will eat it, and then they actually like defecate, and then they pupate. But they try and give them just enough so that they have the ability to have as much nutrients as they need to get through the winter, until they come out again the next year.
Right, that sounds delicious. The next question, is colony collapse in California specific to the non-native honeybee?
Yes, colony collapse disorder is a disorder that is specific to honeybees. And unfortunately, as I'm not a honeybee expert, I don't have a lot of information on them. So I can't go into more detail about what has caused it. Although I do know while people are still experiencing losses, I don't think that as many of the symptoms of just bees abandoning hives as was associated with colony collapse continues. I do want to say one of the great things is that when we create native pollinator habitat, we do also support honeybees. As pollinators, they will visit things that, these habitats. And so if you are a honeybee enthusiast, there is the possibility that you're benefiting them and a bunch of other native pollinators. It's kind of a win-win in that sense.
All right, let's feed all the bees. Another question, is using ground fabric hazardous to insects, especially bees?
Sure. So it really depends on how much of the soil you're covering, but typically, if you are covering the soil, they might not be able, if you have bees from previous years, to emerge. I don't know of any studies that have explicitly looked at that. What I do know, though, is that I was working with a grad student at UC Davis who wanted to do some nesting experiments. We created these enclosures, and she put ground fabric down, and there was this like tiny area where the fabric didn't cover, and all the bees went and nested there. So they will, find the openings and nest adjacent to it, but it definitely could potentially prevent bees from emerging.
All right. Another question. Are there species of bees that target specific species of flowers to pollinate, or is any flower fair game?
Right, absolutely. So there are specialists and generalists, as I alluded to. So bumblebees are notorious generalists. They're long-lived, and so they will visit a bunch of different plant species. There are some bees that visit a few species, but not all of the species. And then there are some that only specialize in a select few. Now, typically, what's interesting is that they're finding that specialization isn't always as one-to-one as they've found. Like sometimes the bees will visit a wide array of other species for the nectar and inadvertently pollinate those, but still bring the pollen from one plant back to their nest. Or, in some years, if their host plant is having a really bad year, they might switch. But there are actually true specialists out there. So it varies, but on the bee species. And there's great papers on pollination networks that kind of show the linkages between plants and pollinators. And there's been neat models done where they'll experimentally remove like a specialist species, and how that affects that plant versus like a bumblebee, which pollinates a bunch of things, and how that might impact more greatly a network. And so, yeah, it definitely matters to plant communities.
Okay. So this is an interesting question. Is there such a thing as artificial pollination technology? And if so, is it able to mitigate a portion of the natural pollinators that are lost?
Yeah, so there's definitely that. One of the things that's used actually in China is human-assisted pollination. So in some places I've heard that pesticides have been used intensively. A lot of bees have disappeared, so they'll go out with paintbrushes and do it by hand. But I do believe that people are working on ways to create like drone bees that can do this. So certainly that's something that could help. But I also think having a robust ecosystem, natural bee community, is really important to a lot more things than just agriculture. So hopefully, even if people are investing in that, they're also investing in habitat and other measures that are supporting native pollinators and the contribution that they can provide to crop systems.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way to go. So here's one. Since pesticides become part of the plant's vascular system, can that get passed on to humans?
Oh, there definitely are studies that look at, there's a great, really long-term study that looks at like concentrations of pesticides in breast milk in the Salinas Valley and how those are and it's not just these systemic ones, but other pesticides. But unfortunately, this is not something that I've studied, and so I can't fully answer that. But a lot of pesticides in the foods we eat are transferred to us and accumulated in our systems and might have some detrimental impacts.
All right, and here's another one. Can you talk about how bumblebees could be considered fish under the California Endangered Species Act?
Well, that's a great question. So that's a long story, but basically, the 4 species of bumblebees were petitioned for listing under the California Endangered Species Act. There was a subsequent lawsuit saying that the Fish and Game Commission did not have the authority to list the species because invertebrates were not explicitly included. However, and in the lower trial courts that won, but upon when it was appealed in the next court, the appellate court unanimously decided that insects were included. There's section 41 of the code, when it defined fish, included invertebrates in the definition of fish, along with mollusks and a number of other things like crustaceans that are certainly not fish. And also they decided that it was not necessarily just aquatic, that it could also be terrestrial. And so based on that definition, they determined that, yes, the commission did have authority. They had also listed in 1981 the Trinity bristle snail, which is a mollusk that is a terrestrial invertebrate. And so because of those 2 reasons, it was determined that they do have this authority.
What an interesting way to enforce their authority for that. So what is your opinion on commercially sold bee hotels for residential backyards? Are there any pros or cons?
You guys have so many loaded questions. This is great. I would say that the best thing to do is to plant, pithy stem plants, so like elderberry or like even raspberry in your yard that bees will nest in. Bee hotels often are not deep enough for bees, so you'll end up attracting a lot of wasps. There's no instruction about how often you should clean them or get rid of them. So sometimes a lot of these bees don't aggregate in such high numbers, and so their parasites can find them, and so you can get a lot more parasitism and disease in them. So I personally don't think that they're that beneficial, and I think they may actually be having some negative impacts. So I recommend habitat over artificial nesting.
Okay. So someone is in the process of adding more pollinator-friendly plants to their yard, including converting their backyard to a meadow. Are there any plants that are most needed or recommended
Ooh. Well, what I would recommend, say you're really interested in supporting the monarch migration, and this really depends on where you are, but say you're located in like the coastal foothills or kind of the areas where they go for their first breeding generation, which is basically like the coast foothills and anywhere in the Central Valley and the Sierra foothills. If you plant early season nectar plants, and there are some lists out there that you can look for, but that is something that's likely to help that first stage of their migration, and often there aren't always as many of those plants out. You could also support their fall migration by planting a lot of later season plants. Certainly we know in California things get dried up and there's not as many resources later in the year, so that's another thing. There's also these plants called early season milkweeds. So there's a few species like Asclepias californica, California milkweed, Asclepias cordifolia, heartleaf milkweed, and these are places where the monarchs might be able to because they come up earlier in the year, the monarchs might be able to use them if they leave those overwintering sites earlier and are not able to find most of the other milkweed species on the landscape. So those are ones we're definitely promoting. But really, I think if you're creating pollinator habitat, again, just extending the bloom period for as long as possible and having a diversity of plant species is a great way to try and hedge your bets and support as many different pollinators as possible.
Right, those are excellent recommendations. Are you aware of any research that's been done to find out or to count the population of different species of bees?
There are so many studies in California by a variety of researchers to look at, bee diversity. And so, there's definitely a lot out there. It's hard to quantify. Something that's neat, the legislature provided the California Department of Food and Ag some funding to DNA barcode all of the invertebrates in California. And so if that, if they're sampling, they should be able to help verify a lot of the bee species in the state, as well as a lot of the other species, hopefully find species we didn't even know existed here. And right now the estimates are that there's at least 27,000 and possibly up to 100,000 invertebrate species in the state. So it'll be great to better understand them so we can better conserve them.
Right. So earlier you mentioned imperiled bee statistics. Do those count for invasives? Do those include invasive bees or just species native to the West Coast?
Gotcha. So I think I provided a few of those assessments. So they're for the native species, not the non-native species, though something that they take into account in some cases is competition within non-native species. But yeah, they're for the native pollinators.
Okay. So can anything be done to help or treat diseased bees or diseased colonies of bees?
Like bumblebees?
Yeah.
So, I think there's a few things that are not directly treating them, because going in and disrupting the nest can be harmful. But one, making sure that you're providing a lot of forage resources and protecting them from pesticides that could have these interactive effects with disease is important. But then really trying to ensure that commercialized bumblebee colonies that are imported to California do not have diseases, and that if they're detected, those commercial bumblebees are exterminated. It's also important to make sure that greenhouses are more secure and those bumblebees are not released into the wild. For honeybees, I know that a lot of beekeepers do checks on them and make sure that they are also low disease, but they can also have higher disease incidence as well. So I think trying to ensure that they're not in really sensitive areas, like sensitive natural areas, high up meadows, where they could be potentially impacting some imperiled species.
All right. Here's kind of an interesting one. Are there any plants here in California that bats are responsible for pollinating?
Oh, definitely there's a lot of cacti that they're responsible for pollinating. That is a question though that unfortunately I don't work on vertebrate pollinators. We have at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife a small mammal coordinator who focuses on bats. We also similarly have a bird coordinator who does the hummingbird. So I am the invertebrate pollinator coordinator, and that means I don't have as much information on what the vertebrate pollinators are doing. So I apologize for that.
No need for apologies. Overall, how do you think California legislators are helping protect pollinators?
Well, one thing that they did for monarchs is they provided some funding to the California Wildlife Conservation Board, and they to create a new grant fund that focused on monarch and pollinator related projects. And I believe that they've awarded millions of dollars to projects throughout the state that are creating on the ground habitat projects for pollinator and monarchs. So I think that that is a great way that they've done this. I also mentioned the DNA barcoding initiative. That's another thing that they've done. So yeah, definitely taking some steps to help them.
All right. Here's kind of an interesting one. Were killer bees really killer? And if so, what happened to them?
You know, again, you're getting into territory where I don't know as much. Africanized bees were definitely, you know, a more aggressive species of bee. They are still out there on the landscape. They occur mostly in tropical environments. And so not as much in California where we have these kind of droughts that are not as great for them. But I do think that they occur in some places in Southern California, and with climate change could extend more north. But I think it's mostly that they're much more protective of their nests and willing to attack in high numbers if you disturb them. So it could still be something that is impactful, but didn't reach the alarm levels that we initially thought they would. I think now there's the murder hornets that were introduced in the Pacific Northwest that are very large wasps that are invasive that could potentially impact a lot of native species. You know, here in California, we have like paper wasps, right? Like, and a bunch of other wasp species that were imported from Europe that can be pretty detrimental. Like, again, they're eat other insects. And I get reports from really concerned people all over the state noting that the wasps just go in and kill a lot of monarchs. So definitely, you know, there are invasive insect species that are damaging native insect populations. Not that so-called killer bees are, but just that there are other ones that we are concerned about.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael. You did a great job with the questions. And Hillary, it's just so interesting and delightful. And I do have one question for you. So what kind of advice do you have for young scientists? Like, I know that there's a lot of kids today that are interested in science. And I was reading your bio, and it's worth checking out Hillary's website at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, because there's also many other scientists that they highlight there. But I'm interested in hearing what you would say to young students who are interested in doing what you're doing, because it's so specialized, and how you found your path in
Well,
science. And then we'll wrap up here.
sure. I mean, I think it's just to follow your interests wherever they might lead, right? I was, you know, at UC Santa Cruz, I got really interested in restoration and started working for restoration companies and doing seed collection, and noticed that there was pollinator deficit and some plants were producing seed. And so, you know, continuing that line of inquiry, I got interested in pollinators and their declines and decided to go to grad school. And I focused more on agriculture, but really wanted to work at the state level, conserving pollinators with a variety of partners, which is what I get to do. I get to work with agencies, nonprofits, members of the public. And I just kept, you know, deepening that initial line of inquiry. It definitely, I never set out to be an entomologist. I actually was really more interested in botany early on, but I just continued, like I said, asking questions and trying to better understand the natural world. And so I think being observant, you know, taking pictures, using Seek or iNaturalist, and just really trying to understand what's going on. And you know, if you're a scientist, you ask questions and you make hypotheses and you try and figure out if what's going on is what you think is going on, and you never have enough information. But I think just having that curious mindset really takes folks pretty far.
That's great. And when we were working with you for this program, I know you were out in the field a lot, like literally. So when you were out in the field, are you gone for weeks at a time, or are you?
Oh, I don't get to go out in the field as much as I used to, but we have scientific aids with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. This is a classification that, you know, is a great entry level position, and people come and, you know, we're hiring one right now to do bumblebee work throughout the entire state. And they get to go out into the field. I usually don't have them go out for weeks at a time, but like a few days a week so they don't get burnt out. But yeah, just going all over. Last week I was in the Mojave looking for bees. And in a few weeks I'll be in Pinnacles, which has the highest bee diversity recorded in California. We'll be up in the north of the state in Siskiyou County looking for the Franklin's bumblebee, which, as I mentioned, hasn't been seen since '98. So yeah, it definitely provides the opportunities to do that. But I also have a lot of meetings with a lot of partners and work with them. So my anecdote is I was teaching my 8-year-old daughter how to net bumblebees last year, and she was like, "Oh, wow, this is really fun. I thought your job was boring. Like you just sat in front of the computer." And I was like, "No, like when you get into the field, it's great." And, you know, she's starting really young, really interested in this. So I think that folks don't realize like you can get involved in these kind of pursuits and community sciences projects from a really young age, and again, contribute important data.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's truly inspiring, and we really appreciate you taking the time, and it's our time is pretty much up here. So I want to thank you so much for being with us, and for everybody who's come and stayed and enjoyed the resources. And I'm going to share one last screen. If you have any questions for Dr. Sardiñas, you can always email us here at the library. And at cslinfo@library.ca.gov. And we'd be happy to pass on your information or comments to the doctor. So I think that wraps it up for this evening. Thank you so much for being here. I know there's a few questions we didn't get to, but thank you all for having such great questions and for being here. And so go out and help the pollinators. And thank you, Hillary. Really, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I really,
yeah. I'm really proud. We love at the library. We love the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. You guys are just doing so many amazing things. So with that, I will say goodnight and thank you, Michael. And thanks to everybody for being here, and have a great evening and enjoy the rest of Earth Week out there and go make a difference. Okay. Thank you. Good night.